objectively, while Jesus is the central focus of Christianity, the founder of Christianity in any religion book is who? Is Paul.
You sure about that? You sure about that? You sure about that?
Because the version of Jesus that survived was not the version of the people around him, it was the version of Paul.
Muslims often claim that Paul is the one who invented Christianity, but this is utter nonsense. Paul taught the same message about Jesus that the disciples taught. First, Paul cited early creeds and hymns that he received from the early church. And his theology is in line with his pre-Pauline material, so obviously other Christians were preaching the same message that he would later come to preach. Some of this material directly contradicts the teachings of Islam, like the Carmen Christi of Philippians 2, which has a very high Christology, or the Creed of 1 Corinthians 15, which teaches that Jesus died and resurrected, which contradicts the teachings we see in traditional Sunni Islam. Second, the Gospel of Mark is not dependent on Paul's letters, and yet it teaches the same theology. Scholars like Maurice Casey and James Crossley note that Mark's source was an Aramaic speaker and a member of the 12. The scholar Paul Anderson points out the Gospel of John is also another independent source, not contingent on Paul or Mark. Then we also have the independent material of Matthew, the independent material of Luke, and other Christian sources like the epistles of John, James, and Jude. All of this is teaching the same theology. So the idea Paul invented Christianity is just flat out wrong. We have numerous early Christian sources that are all teaching the same theology and cohere well together. The original source of all this is Jesus, not Paul.
So Paul is the prophet here, right? The one who's receiving his own revelation, who preaches a gospel of Christ, who preaches a version of Christ, and you don't have to look too far in history to see that the disciples of Jesus, peace be upon him, did not appreciate what Paul was doing.
Okay, where? Where in history do we see this? You didn't cite any sources.
When they heard about what Paul was doing, those that were leftovers from the actual followers of Christ, of Peter and others, they argued with Paul that this was not the Christianity of Christ.
No, they did not. You're just making things up. The only major dispute we see in the early church is on whether or not Gentiles had to keep the Mosaic Law, and the evidence shows that Peter and James came on Paul's side. Paul also says in Galatians that when he met with Peter and James in Jerusalem, they added nothing to what he was preaching. And there's not a scrap of evidence that Peter and James disagree with his statement, nor is there any evidence that the disciples taught a different theology that was more in line with Islam. Muslims accuse Paul of inventing something that Jesus didn't teach. Meanwhile, they have the audacity to tell us this myth, that in the first century, the disciples were disputing with Paul and really teaching Islam, when there's not a scrap of evidence to support this fantasy they've told us.
And you had other Christian groups that arose, so followers of Jesus was very fluid.
Other Christian groups which were heretical did not begin to arise until the late 1st century, and none of them, whether it was the Ebionites or the various Gnostic groups, taught the exact theology that we find in Islam.
If you really want to dig into Isa alayhi salam's life, you got to go historically.
And if you do that, you'll arrive at Christianity. Not this myth that the historical Jesus of the 1st century is really the Islamic Jesus invented in the 7th century.